Welcome to Snoozecast, the podcast designed to help you fall asleep. Find us on snoozecast.com and follow us on social media and wherever you listen to podcasts. Our current goal is to get to 100 reviews on the Podcasts app to help as many new listeners find us as possible. If you haven't subscribed and written a review yet, please do. Thank you to everyone who's taken the time to do so already. Please know that we read every single review, often out loud to each other, and we can't tell you how happy it makes us to know we are helping you sleep. This episode is brought to you by antiquarian bookstore owners. Tonight, we'll read the opening chapters to Mazes and Labyrinths, a general account of their history and development, written by W.H. Matthews and published in 1922. The history of the maze is paradoxically explored as both a tool for spiritual inquiry and as a vexing trap. Apparently, he wrote the heavy tome in less than 3 years, and it may have been a way for Matthews to deal with the aftermath of his time as a soldier in the labyrinth trenches of World War I. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. Introduction. A delightful air of romance and mystery surrounds the whole subject of labyrinths and mazes. The hedge maze, which is the only type with which most of us have a first-hand acquaintance, is generally felt to be a survival of a romantic age, even though we esteem its function as nothing higher than that of a playground for children. Many a tender intrigue has been woven around its dark yew alleys. Mr. Compton Mackenzie, for example, introduces it most effectively as a lover's rendezvous in The Passionate Elopement. And no doubt, the readers of romantic literature will recall other instances of a like nature. The story of Fair Rosamond's Bower is one which will leap to the mind in this connection. This type of maze alone is worth more than a passing thought, but it is far from being the only, or even the most interesting, development of the labyrinth idea. What is the difference, it may be asked, between a maze and a labyrinth? The answer is little or none. Some writers seem to prefer to apply the word maze to hedge mazes only, using the word labyrinth to denote the structures described by the writers of antiquity, or as a general term for any confusing arrangement of paths. Others, again, show a tendency to restrict the application of the term maze to cases in which the idea of a puzzle is involved. It would certainly seem somewhat inappropriate to talk of the Cretan maze or the Hampton Court labyrinth, but generally speaking, we may use the words interchangeably, regarding maze as merely the northern equivalent of the classic labyrinth. Both words have come to signify a complex path of some kind, But when we press for a closer definition, we encounter difficulties. We cannot, for instance, say that it is a tortuous branched path designed to baffle or deceive those who attempt to find the goal to which it leads. For though that description holds good in some cases, it ignores the many cases in which there is only one path without branches, and therefore no intent to baffle or mislead, and others again in which there is no definitive goal. We cannot say that it is a winding path bounded by walls or hedges, for in many instances there are neither walls nor hedges. One of the most famous labyrinths, for example, consisted chiefly of a vast and complicated series of rooms and columns. In fact, we shall find it convenient to leave the question of the definition of the words and also that of their origin until we have examined the various examples that exist or are known to have existed. It may be necessary, here and there, to make reference to various archaeological or antiquarian books and other writings, but the outlook of the general reader, rather than that of the professed student, has been mainly borne in mind. The object of this book is simply to provide a readable survey of a subject which, in view of the lure it has exercised throughout many ages and under a variety of forms, has been almost entirely neglected in our literature. The subject of mazes and labyrinths treated from a general and not a purely archaeological, horticultural, mathematical, or artistic point of view. Such references as have been made have therefore been accompanied in most cases by some explanatory or descriptive phrase, a provision which might be considered unnecessary or out of place in a book written for the trained student. For the benefit of such as may wish to verify or to investigate more fully, and of the matters dealt with, a classified list of references has been compiled and will be found at the end of this book. The first summary of any importance to be published in this country on the subject was a paper by the Venerable Edward Trollope, FSA, Archdeacon of Stowe, which appeared in the Archaeological Journal and in the Proceedings of a Provincial Archaeological Society in 1858. Nearly all subsequent writers on the subject, in this country, at any rate, have drawn largely upon the paper in question, and have made little advance upon it. The Encyclopaedia Britannica contains an illustrated article written originally by a botanist and chiefly concerned with hedge mazes. Such books as Rouse Ball's Mathematical Recreations, Andrew's Ecclesiastical Curiosities, and Dudney's Amusements in Mathematics devote each a chapter or so to the matter, and from time to time there have been brief displays of interest in some aspect or other of the topic in popular periodicals, the most notable being a pair of richly illustrated articles in Country Life in 1903. A condensed and scholarly review of the subject, insofar as it is relevant to his main thesis, is contained in the first volume of Mr. A.B. Cook's ponderous work on Zeus. A similar remark applies to the recently published Volume 1 of Sir Arthur Evans' magnificent summary of his Cretan researches, The Palace of Minos at Knossos. The articles are characterized by great boldness and enthusiasm and show a wide range of knowledge, but it is probable that if the author had lived, mature consideration would have led him to modify some of his conclusions. That is the most recent work of importance on the subject, though the new work by Sir A. Evans mentioned above contains much interesting and valuable information on certain aspects. In the following chapters, an attempt is made to set forth, as readably as may be, an account of the various devices in which the labyrinth idea has been embodied to indicate where examples may be found, to give some notion of the speculations which have been made regarding their origins, and to consider the possibilities of the idea from the point of view of amusement and recreation. The earliest labyrinths of which mention is made by the classic writers are those of Egypt and Crete, and we shall find it convenient to consider these first of all. We will then notice the other labyrinths alluded to by the writers of antiquity, and pass on to a consideration of labyrinthine designs introduced by way of ornament or symbolism in various objects of later classic art. We shall see that the labyrinth idea was adopted and developed by the Christian Church in the Middle Ages, and will note its progress as a medium of horticultural embellishment. It will be interesting to examine the mathematical principles, such as they are, which underlie the construction or solution of mazes, also to see in what a number of ways these principles may be applied. We shall find that our inquiry will bring us into contact with a greater variety of subjects than one would at first be inclined to imagine, and that labyrinths and mazes need not by any means be considered as exclusively a concern of archaeologists and children. Incidentally, we may help to rescue from threatened oblivion a certain class of native antiquities, small and diminishing in number, but certainly worth sufficient attention to ensure their preservations, namely the turf labyrinths. As to the actual origin and primary purpose of these devices, we cannot be dogmatic on the evidence before us, and herein, perhaps, lies a good deal of their charm. When we can classify and date with precision any object which is not of a utilitarian nature, we relegate it at once to our mental museum, and a museum is only too apt to become an oubliette. But when there is a considerable margin for speculation, or, as we usually say, a certain amount of mystery in the case, we are more likely to find pleasure in rehandling it, looking at it from different points of view and wondering about it. Let us grant, by all means, that there are quite sufficient unsolved riddles in nature and life without raising up artificial mysteries. Let us even admit that when evidence is available, which, by the way, is not the same thing as existent, it is better to settle a question straight away than to leave it open to further argument. At the same time, let us not be too hasty in accepting speculations, however shrewd, as proved facts. Antiquarian books should naturally be as free as possible from actual misstatements, but they have lost all their charm when they become collections of bald, dogmatic statements or mere descriptive catalogues. The Egyptian Labyrinth. Accounts of the ancient writers. The earliest structure of any kind to which we find the word labyrinth applied was a huge building situated in the north of Egypt, a land always noted for its stupendous monuments, and was probably constructed more than 2,000 years before the commencement of the Christian era. We live in an age when the use of a constructional steel enables the dreams of the architect to materialize in many ways that would astonish the builders of old. Nevertheless, the modern citizen, whatever his nationality, can rarely resist a feeling akin to awe when making his first acquaintance with such works as the pyramids of Egypt. One can imagine, then, what a profound effect these massive edifices must have exerted on the minds of travelers in earlier ages. We find, as we might expect, many wild exaggerations and individual descriptions and corresponding discrepancies between the various accounts of any particular monument. And this is to some extent the case with regards to the Egyptian labyrinth. A fairly detailed and circumstantial account has come down to us from the Greek writer Herodotus. Herodotus, who is rightly spoken of as the father of history, was born about 484 BC and lived about 60 years, of which he spent a considerable number in traveling about over most of the then known world. Those who are fortunate enough to be able to read his work in their original tongue are charmed by their freshness, simplicity, and harmonious rhythm. But those who look to him for accurate information on any but contemporary events or matters which he was personally acquainted are apt to find a rather too credulous acceptance of the wonderful. No doubt, the poetical instinct in Herodotus was stronger than the critical spirit of the true historian. But so far as the records of his personal observations are concerned, there seems to be no reason to accuse him of gross exaggeration. The labyrinth of Egypt he himself visited, as he tells us in his second book, and seems to have been considerably impressed by it. After describing how the Egyptians divided the land into 12 parts, or nomes, and set a king over each, he says that they agreed to combine together to leave a memorial of themselves. Then they constructed the labyrinth, just above the lake, and nearly opposite the city of crocodiles. I found it, he says, greater than words could tell. For although the temple at Ephesus and that at Samos are celebrated works, yet all of the works and buildings of the Greeks put together would certainly be inferior to this labyrinth as regards labor and expense. Even the pyramids, he tells us, were surpassed by the labyrinth. It has 12 covered courts with opposite doors, 6 courts on the north side and 6 on the south, all communicating with one another, and one wall surrounding them all. There are 2 sorts of rooms, one sort above, the other sort below ground, 1,500 of each sort, or 3,000 in all. He says that he was allowed to pass through the upper rooms only, the lower range being strictly guarded from visitors, as they contained the tombs of the kings who had built the labyrinth, also the tombs of the sacred crocodiles. The upper rooms he describes as being of superhuman size, and the system of passages through the courts, rooms, and colonnades very intricate and bewildering. The roof of the whole affair, he says, is of stone, and the walls are covered with carvings. Each of the courts is surrounded by columns of white stone, perfectly joined. Outside the labyrinth, and at one corner of it, a pyramid about 240 feet in height, with huge figures carved upon it and approached by an underground passage. Herodotus expresses even greater admiration, however, for the lake beside the labyrinth, which he describes as being of vast size and artificially constructed, having 2 pyramids arising from its bed, each supporting a colossal seated statue. The water for the lake, he says, is brought from the Nile by a canal. The labyrinth and the lake are also described at some length by another great traveler, Strabo, who lived about 4 centuries after Herodotus. He wrote, among other works, a geography of the world in 17 volumes, the last of which treats of Egypt and other parts of Africa. Like Herodotus, he speaks of the labyrinth from personal observation. After referring to the lake and the manner in which it is used as the storage reservoir for the water of the Nile, he proceeds to describe the labyrinth. A work equal to the pyramids, he says it is. A large palace composed of as many palaces as there were formerly gnomes. There are an equal number of courts, surrounded by columns and adjoining one another, all in a row and constituting one building, like a long wall with the courts in front of it. The entrances to the courts are opposite the wall. In front of these entrances are many long covered alleys with winding, intercommunicating passages, so that a stranger could not find his way in or out unless with a guide. Each of these structures is roofed with a single slab of stone, as are also the covered alleys, no timber or any other material being used. If one ascends to the roof, he says, one looks over a field of stone. The courts were in a line, supported by a row of 27 monolithic columns, the walls also being constructed of stones as of a great size. At the end of the building is the royal tomb, consisting of a square pyramid and containing the body of Amandes. Strabo says that it was the custom of the 12 gnomes of Egypt to assemble with their priests and priestesses, each gnome in its own court, for the purpose of sacrificing to the gods and administering justice in important matters. He mentions that the inhabitants of the particular gnome in the vicinity worshipped the crocodile, which was kept in the lake and answered to the name of Sebek. This animal was apparently quite tame and used to be presented by visitors with offerings of bread, wine, honey, and milk. In certain parts of his work, Strabo speaks rather disrespectfully of Herodotus as a writer, classing him as a marvel monger. But it will be seen then, in several important aspects, that these two accounts of the Egyptian labyrinth are in fair agreement. Another writer of about the same period as Strabo, known as Diodorus the Sicilian, wrote a long, rambling compilation which he called a historical library, in which he describes the Egyptian labyrinth and the lake. He says the latter was constructed by King Maurus, who left a place in the middle where he built himself a sepulchre and 2 pyramids, one for himself and one for his queen, surmounted by colossal seated statues. Diodorus says that the king gave the money resulting from the sale of the fish caught in the lake, amounting to a silver talent a day, to his wife to buy her pins. A generation or so later, the Roman writer Pomponius Mela gives a short account of this labyrinth, probably at second hand, and early in the 1st century of the Christian era. Pliny, in his Natural History, has a good deal to say on the subject. Mela also refers to the fact that the roof was of stone, and notes as a surprising point that the parts around the entrance were constructed of Parisian marble, whilst the columns of the other parts were of senite. This great mass is so solidly built that the lapse of time has been quite unable to destroy it, but it has been badly ravaged by the people, and they have always detested it. To describe the whole of it in detail would be quite impossible, as it is divided up into regions and prefectures called nomes, 30 in number, with a great palace to each. In addition, it must contain temples of all the gods of Egypt, and 40 statues in the same number of sacred shrines, as well as numerous pyramids. He describes it further as having banquet halls reached by steep ascents, flights of 90 steps leading down. Some of the palaces are so made that the opening of a door makes a terrifying sound as if thunder. Most of the buildings are in total darkness. Outside the labyrinth, there is another great heap of buildings called the Teron, under which are passages leading to other subterranean